Welcome to Watchman on the Wall, a daily outreach of Southwest Radio Ministries and SWRC.com. God is still on the throne, and prayer changes things. Today, Bill Federer will help us speak up for freedom. Watchman on the Wall is here each day to bring clarity to the chaos and remind everyone who tunes in that God is still on the throne and prayer changes things. Would you help Watchman on the Wall grow by inviting others to tune in? They can listen on the radio or through our SWRC mobile app. They can also access the program when they subscribe to our podcasts. Thank you for helping Watchmen on the Wall expand and reach even more people with the clarity of the good news of the gospel. Last October, author and historian Bill Federer shared a special presentation at our Gettysburg Conference on how silence on the important issues of the day can lead to destruction. Today, we're going to hear a portion of this important talk.
Well, it's a tremendous honor for me to be here, and probably 30 years ago, I came out with my first book. It's called America's God and Country Encyclopedia Quotations, and I got a call from Southwest Radio Church Ministries, and Dr. Kenneth Hill interviewed me. So one of my very, very first interviews I ever did in my career was with Dr. Kenneth Hill. Since that time, I've written about 30 books. I've spoken in all 50 states. Ran for Congress 3 times in there. That's a whole nother story. But I'm thrilled with this new book, Silence Equals Consent. And Southwest Radio Church Ministries designed the cover and did the typesetting of it. And I'm so thrilled. And so please, I think you'll be very blessed if you get a copy of the book. And I have a PowerPoint. Hopefully you can see the screen up here. I first want to address Christian nationalism. Have you heard that term? Did you know that nationalism is the opposite of globalism? There are people who are globalists. One, Brock Chisholm, he was the first director of the World Health Organization. Have you heard of that organization? And Brock Chisholm said, to achieve world government, it is necessary to remove from the minds of men their national patriotism. Lo and behold, globalists do not like people wanting to preserve their nation. Now, how do they plan on having this world government? Are people just going to voluntarily give up their freedom? No, it's called the Great Reset. It's an orchestrated crisis, a healthcare crisis, food shortage crisis, currency collapse crisis, and then people will run to their government and say, help. And the government's like, oh, we're glad you asked, we'll help, but we're going to take control of your lives. In the process, here is the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, says the world must brace for a series of massive unknown crises. Well, how does he know about them? And so Klaus Schwab, World Economic Forum, Agenda 2030 video says you'll own nothing and be happy. Well, that sounds a lot like Karl Marx, who said the theory of communism may be summed up in a single sentence, abolition of private property. Well, if you abolish private property, you'll own nothing. Lo and behold, the globalists want world communism, which they plan on being in charge of. Michael Rechtenwald wrote Imprimis magazine, What is the Great Reset? A two-tiered economy with profitable monopolies and the state on top and socialism for the majority below. They want to control the world. And secondly, nationalism is good or bad depending on the nation. In socialist, communist, or Islamist nations, nationalism is bad because there's no individual rights. Nazi stands for National Socialist Workers' Party. There's no individual rights. Ask the Jews. Well, we're a republic that believes in rights from a creator. Why is that important? Because God gave them, and the government cannot take them away. They come from a source higher than the government. And these rights are freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom to defend your wife and family, freedom to have a trial by a jury of your peers, and freedom from cruel and unusual punishment. Those are sort of good things. And everyone's equal. And to top it all off, it's government from the consent of the governed. You're in charge. I mean, so seriously, how could a nation get any better than that? You have rights the government cannot take away. In fact, the government's job is to guarantee to you your creator-given rights. Everyone's equal, and you're in charge. Well, The last is Christian nationalism used to be called Christian patriotism. The modern usage of Christian nationalism was in 2006, and it was the left bringing up this for the same reason that they call pro-life organizations anti-abortion. Have you ever seen where every single time that the news media refers to a pro-life topic, they'll always call pro-life people anti-abortion? Why do they do that? Negative word association. Why do they call Christian patriots Christian nationalists? Negative word association. And did you know the word nationalism is not even in Noah Webster's 1828 dictionary? The word patriotism is characteristic of a good citizen, love of one's country. Washington, to the distinguished character of patriot, it should be our highest glory to laud the more distinguished character of Christian. Lincoln, inaugural, said intelligence, patriotism, Christianity, and a firm reliance on him are still competent to adjust in the best way all our present difficulty. He mentions patriotism and Christianity right next to each other in his inaugural. Now, he freed the slaves, but the Democrats in the Deep South had Jim Crow laws, black codes, and started the KKK and had lynchings. Tuskegee Institute did research and identified 4,743 documented lynchings. There were more than that. Well, about 1,200 of those were white Republicans in the South, starting the freedmen's colleges and the historical black colleges and registering the freed blacks to vote, and they were getting lynched too. And so there's 13,000 pages of documentation of these lynchings. Did you know elections? You used to, well, I'll get into that later. Teddy Roosevelt, Republican, had the first black man in the White House as an honored guest for dinner, Booker T. Washington, president of Tuskegee. And Roosevelt said, the mob lynches a Negro. Every Christian patriot in America needs to lift up his voice in loud and eternal protest against the mob spirit. FDR, during World War II, he's defending our nation and he's passing out Bibles, millions of them, Gideon's Bibles. And he writes the foreword, as Commander-in-Chief, I take pleasure in commending the reading of the Bible to all who serve in the armed forces. I wonder if the mainstream media would call Franklin Roosevelt a Christian nationalist. He's definitely defending our nation, and he's passing out Bibles. Roosevelt said, those forces hate democracy and Christianity as two phases of the same civilization. They oppose democracy because it is Christian. They oppose Christianity because it preaches democracy. Eisenhower said, any group that awakens all of us is a dedicated, patriotic group that can well take the Bible in one hand, the flag in the other, and march ahead. No problem with Bible and flag. And so, in 1965, 93% of Americans were Christian, 69% Protestant, 24% Catholic, and then 3% of the country Jewish. So the country was always Judeo-Christian and patriotic, but the left engages in something called projection, where they blame you for what they're doing. It's in the Bible. Potiphar's wife accused Joseph of lusting after her when she was lusting after him. So lo and behold, they call you hateful when they're hateful. They call you intolerant when they're intolerant. They say that you want to steal the election when they want to steal the election. It's in the news every day, right? And so they're the ones that want to set up a nationalism. It's a woke nationalism, and it's very intolerant. They want to steamroll over the rights of anybody that does not surrender their conscience to the government. And if you don't go along with their woke agenda, you're going to get canceled, lose your job, and so forth. So follow the money. The same globalists that are funneling money into seminaries to teach Christians not to get involved in politics, they're funneling money to their LGBTQ plus activists to get them involved in politics. What a great strategy. Give money to silence your opposition and give money to activate your supporters. And so, America was founded by Christians of different denominations. I read through every charter of every colony. Maryland was Catholic, Virginia was Anglican, Rhode Island was Baptist, New York was Dutch Reformed, Delaware and New Jersey were originally Swedish Lutheran, Connecticut and New Hampshire were Congregationalist, Pennsylvania Quaker, and they did not get along. And they tar and feather each other. But then they had to work together against the King of England. And after the Revolution, their attitude was, we may not always agree on religion, but you were willing to fight and die for my freedom. I need to let you practice your faith. So at the at the First Continental Congress, they all showed up and they were having a motion for prayer, but it almost got slapped down. John Adams writes, when Congress met, Mr. Cushing made a motion that it should be open with prayer. It was opposed by Mr. Jay of New York and Mr. Rutledge of South Carolina because we were so divided in religious sentiments that we could not join in the same act of worship. Mr. Samuel Adams arose and says he was no bigot and could hear a prayer of any gentleman of piety and virtue who was at the same time a friend of his country. God bless them for working together even though they didn't all believe exactly the same thing. There's a quote attributed to St. Augustine, unity in the essentials, liberty in the non-essentials, and charity throughout all. What's the essential? We're sinners. Jesus died on the cross to pay for our sins, and it's only through Jesus you get to heaven, right? And then there's the non-essentials, and then we love each other. I mean, you think of it, most men don't agree with their wife on everything, but you love your wife, right? I don't even agree with myself on everything. So God says it's the unity of the Spirit. And so these denominations of Christians came over in two waves, sort of like two flavors. The 1600 Puritans, 1700 Pietists. The Puritans pioneered a covenant form of government where everybody participated, and the Pietists brought revival. And the problem was that when you would get saved, you would withdraw from worldly things, including government. The Puritans got nicknamed Old Lights, and the Pietists got nicknamed New Lights. So let's unpack this. So we first have to appreciate the Puritans and their pioneering of a covenant form of government. You know what the default setting for human government is? If we were to get rid of all police, what would happen? Anarchy, and then what would happen after that? Gangs. And a gang leader rules through fear, and a glorified gang leader we call a king or a pharaoh or a Caesar, Kaiser, Sultan, Czar. Power concentrates into the hands of one person, and if you're his friend, you're more equal. If you're not his friend, you're less equal, and if you're his enemy, you're dead. It's called treason, or you're a slave. That's the norm. The first historical reference to a gang leader king was Nimrod, Tower of Babel. And Josephus, the Jewish commentator, said Nimrod wanted to build his tower so high that if God destroyed the world again with a flood, he could survive on top. And he made everybody in town bake bricks and bring them, or he would kill them. He wanted people to fear his government more than fear God. That's the beginning of this. Fear government more than fear God. Goes back to Nimrod. Now, since the population of the world was there, right, just down the hill from Mount Ararat, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, called the Fertile Crescent, and most archaeologists say this is where civilization began, and Nimrod wanted to control it. In a sense, Nimrod was the first one that wanted a one-world government. He was the first globalist. Population of the world is there. He wanted to control it. God comes down and confuses the languages, and the people scatter into language groups that turn into nations. Lo and behold, nations were God's invention to postpone a one-world government. Take the population of the world, break it into these subgroups. They'll sort of cancel each other out. But every generation has a Nimrod pharaoh that wants to conquer other nations. Now, one of the things I did is I spent years researching every single century of recorded human history to document what the most common form of government is, and it's kings. And if you, in geometry, there's something called the Fibonacci sequence, phi, phi, or the golden ratio. It's a rate of geometric expansion that you observe in a seashell or a tornado or a galaxy. And it gets applied to other areas for like finance. When Bitcoin first took off. They said, oh, it's going to grow at this exponential rate, right, until the government stepped in. But I thought, has anybody applied this to history? And so that's what I did. I would go through, you got Nimrod, Tower of Babel, and then you got Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, and then you have Sargon of Akkadian, and 2,000 years of Egyptian pharaohs, 5,000 years of Chinese emperors, 700 BC, Assyria's got the biggest empire, Nineveh's the capital, right? Jonah went there, and Nineveh's conquered by Babylon, conquered by Persia. Cyrus of Persia lets the Jews go back and rebuild the temple. He's got the biggest empire. Persia's conquered by Alexander the Great, 333 BC. He's got the biggest empire. He stopped from going into India. Chandragupta, the Maurya Empire, controls a quarter of the world's population. And then 2 BC, Augustus Caesar has the biggest empire. He even wanted a worldwide tracking system. It's called the census. Tax enrollment. If he could have had access to 5G and cell phones and facial recognition software, I bet he'd been tempted to do that. And then an Ascomite empire in Africa. And Attila the Hun, 450 AD, he had an army of 500,000 men wiping out cities. And then Justinian in the Byzantine Empire. And then 7th century Islam, conquered from the Persian Gulf to the Atlantic Ocean, conquer Spain. And then 800 AD, Charlemagne's crowned Holy Roman Emperor of all of Europe. And then 1000 AD, Vikings. Boats with low keels go up every river in Europe. They've got the biggest empire. 12th century, 1200 AD, Genghis Khan kills 30 million people from Korea to Hungary. He's got the biggest empire. Kublai Khan, his son, 1300s, Tamerlane, and then Ivan the Terrible of Russia in the 1400s. And then this hemisphere, the same thing's happening. You have Montezuma, and he's the head of the Aztecs, and they're taking captured tribes to the top of their pyramid and ripping their beating hearts out to the sun god. And then the 1500s, the King of Spain has the biggest empire that planet Earth had ever seen. The Philippines are named after his son, King Philip. And then 1600s, King Louis XIV, the Sun King of France, has the biggest empire. And then finally, 1800s, Britain has the largest empire the planet Earth has ever seen. And anybody that can plot on a graph sees that at some point it is going to max out on a global level. And Jesus says wheat and tares grow together till the harvest. And it's this attitude that before the flood, people were living hundreds of years. Methuselah, 969 years. And the Jewish commentators said that not just did they live that long, but they had health to live that long, and they had plenty of food. The Jewish Midrash says that in one planting, they would get enough food for 40 years. And so what happens when people have plenty, like after World War II, we had the 60s, when you had plenty, you get into depravity. And so what happened? They got depravity, and it says right before the flood, the thoughts of man were on evil continually, and they chose not to retain God in their thoughts. And it says it broke God's heart. It repented God that he even made man. It's like he made us for fellowship, and could you imagine the Holy Spirit in front of somebody's face for centuries trying to get their attention, and they so structured their lives they don't even think about God. And so after the flood, God said, we're going to try plan B. If the blessings are not going to turn people to me, after the flood, we're going to have shorter lifespans where there's going to be wars and famines and all kinds of short. And guess what? People turned to God in times of crises, right? In times of crises, people turn to Christ. And so if we get through this crisis, there'll be another one. We get through that crisis, there'll be another one. It's sort of like a mini harvesting time. But wherever there's a king, you have to believe what the king tells you to believe, or it's considered treason. Remember Nebuchadnezzar, when I blow my trumpet, you bow to my statue. Like Nimrod, you bake bricks and bring them, or I'm going to kill you. I want you to fear government. And something happens in 1517 called the Reformation. And suddenly you have lots of people believing something different than their king. Northern Germany and Sweden are Lutheran, Switzerland, Calvinist, Scotland, Presbyterian, Holland, Dutch Reform. And Greece was Greek Orthodox, Russia was Russian Orthodox, and Italy, Spain, France, Austria, Poland stayed Catholic. And a lot of killing went on. You had Catholics killing Protestants, and you had Protestants killing Catholics, and you had Spanish Catholics killing French Catholics, and you had Anglican Protestants killing Presbyterian Protestants. A lot of killing going on. But the point I want to make is you had to believe the way your king told you to believe, or you were committing treason within your country. And so Spain controlled the Netherlands, and they became Dutch Reformed. And King Philip of Spain did not like that. So in 1572, he sends in the Iron Duke of Alba, and he kills 10,000 Dutch Reformed in Antwerp, Holland, leaves their bodies piled in the street. And the same year, 1572, Queen of France, Catherine de' Medici, she kills 30,000 Huguenots called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, throws her body in the Seine River. And so you have scholars in Europe struggling with a Bible verse. Romans 13. Let everyone be subject to the governing authority, for there's no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. It's like, yeah, but what if the authority that exists wants to kill your wife and kids, right? They caught him praying the wrong way. And so some people protested, and they were nicknamed Protestants. And one was John Calvin. He said, we are subject to the men who rule over us, but subject only in the Lord. If they command anything against him, let us not pay the least regard to it. So now he's introducing this idea that it's a conditional obeying of the government. And it's like Ephesians 6. Children, obey your parents. But what if there's a bad parent who tells the kid to sell themselves into prostitution and kill the neighbor? Is the child supposed to obey that parent? No, the child obeys the parent as long as the parent's telling them to do something that lines up with God's word. You obey the government as long as the government's telling you to do something that lines up with God's word. Why would God tell you to do something in his word and then tell you to submit to a government that tells you not to do what he just got done telling you to do? It's what Martin Luther King Jr. wrote in his letter from the Birmingham jail. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. One has not only a legal, but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. So you obey the government as long as the government's telling you to do something that lines up with the law of God. And so the Calvinists pioneered how to have a government without a king. And it influenced lots of denominations, particularly the Puritans. And so Secretary of Navy George Bancroft wrote, Puritanism had exalted the laity. So it's called a covenant form of government. They got their idea from ancient Israel. You get rights from God. You are fair to your neighbor because you're accountable to God. You get blessings from God, and you voluntarily share them with your neighbor as charity because you're doing it as unto God. It's not socialism where the government takes away your stuff involuntarily, gives it to somebody you'll never meet, and they don't care where the money came from. No, it's your stuff. And you have an opportunity to show on the outside the love of God that's on the inside. And so we have to appreciate this covenant form of government. The norm is kings. Good kings, bad kings, good kings, bad kings. Let's say there's a bad king, and we all work really hard, and we get rid of him, and we put in a good king. But then his sons are bad. So now we're back where we started. We got to work really hard, get rid of that bad king, put in a good king, and then his sons are bad. I mean, here's David, the best king ever. His oldest son, Amnon, rapes a daughter, Tamar, is murdered by the son Absalom, who tries to overthrow David. Another son, Adonijah, tries to overthrow David. Solomon's good for a while until he marries 1,000 wives and builds pagan temples. This is the best king ever, David, and his own sons go off track. So the brilliance of a covenant form of government is you get rid of the bad king and you maintain order in society without the rubber band snapping back with a new king. And so where did the Puritans get this idea? The Bible. But what part of the Bible? The first 400 years out of Egypt before they had a king. And so around 1400 BC, you have millions of Israelites come out of Egypt. And for 4 centuries, there's no king, right? It's a unique period called the Hebrew Republic. And I was reminded of, no, remind me your name, I'm drawing a blank, the Merneptah Stele. Clayton. So Clayton was showing me that around 1300 BC or so, they discovered that the Pharaoh in Egypt was conquering, and it has this little symbol for conquering a king and a kingdom, conquering. And then it conquered into Israel. It had this little symbol for people. It's like even the Egyptians, like something strange going on in Israel. It's like they have all these people there, but there's no king. It was a total anomaly in world history. Millions of people, no king. Thank you, Clayton, for bringing that to my attention. And so it worked because everybody was taught the law and everybody was personally accountable to God to follow the law. So you have an opportunity to steal. Nobody's around. You know you can get away with it. And then you think, God's watching me. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable in the future. Maybe I should hesitate stealing. And it creates a tiny thing in your head called a conscience. If everybody in the country believes this, you can get rid of the bad king and you can maintain order in society without the rubber band snapping back with a new king. And it worked for 400 years until the priests went woke. Right? There's no sin anymore. Here is Eli, the high priest. His own sons are sleeping with women in the very tent where the Ark of the Covenant is. Another Levite with a silver graven image in the house of a guy named Micah. The tribe of Dan comes along, steals this graven image, and says to this Levite, come along with us. You can be a priest to our whole tribe with this graven image. And you're like scratching your head like, isn't that one of the commandments? You're not supposed to have graven images? And then the terrible story of a Levite with a concubine. The law says the Levite's to marry a virgin of his own tribe. Here he is with the woman he's not even married to. He's not following the law. And they're in a house that gets surrounded by sodomites. Something about that behavior that appears at the last stages of a people ruling themselves. This casting off of self-restraint. Poor concubines raped to death, and by the time you're grossed out, you read this line, every man did that which was right in their own eyes. Why? Because the priests stopped teaching them what was right in the Lord's eyes. So they all go to Samuel the prophet, and they say this self-government system's not working anymore. We want to be like the other countries. We want a king.
Bill Federer's complete presentation is available in our Gettysburg Conference DVD set. Unlock prophetic insights and deepen your understanding of the end times with our Prophecy in the News Live DVD set. This exclusive collection from October's 3-day Gettysburg Conference features presentations from 12 renowned speakers and Bible scholars, with topics like Israel in Bible prophecy, the New America, Rise of the One World Mind, Silence Equals Consent, and much more. Order this complete conference DVD set when you call 1-800-652-1144. That's 1-800-652-1144. You can also order this important DVD set on our website, swrc.com. Tomorrow, we explore the coming temple with Dr. Lonnie Shipman. Be sure to tune in by downloading our free SWRC mobile app or by simply subscribing to our Watchman on the Wall podcast. Watchman on the Wall is a production of Southwest Radio Ministries and is supported by faithful listeners like you. Visit swrc.com. That's swrc.com.